Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for this joint UJA-CJA program. For those of you who aren't familiar with UJA or CJA, just let me take a minute to explain who we are. We sometimes describe UJA Federation as a united way of the Jewish community. UJA brings together the Jewish community to fundraise, plan, and allocate resources in support of a world-class network of local, national, and international Jewish organizations. There are similar federations in cities and communities across Canada and, in fact, across North America. CJA stands for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and CJA is the advocacy agent of the Jewish federations across Canada, including UJA. We are thrilled to have close to 300 participants registered for this webinar today, and more watching on Facebook Live, both from the Jewish community and from other communities, which I think speaks loudly to the power of Herzl's message and, of course, the star power of our presenter, David Matlow. We're honored to have David as our presenter today. Many of you know him from his professional career as a partner at Goodman's in corporate and private equity. David also has a long and very impressive volunteer history with the Jewish community, for which we are very grateful, including, but not limited to, past chair of the Jewish Foundation of Greater Toronto, member of the board of directors of the Ontario Jewish Archives and the I Center for Israel Education, and co-chair of the 2015 UJA campaign. And as many of you know, David owns the world's largest private collection of Theodor Herzl memorabilia, over 5,000 items, which he has exhibited across Canada and the United States. David speaks regularly to schools, synagogues, and other groups about Herzl and his continued relevance, hoping to inspire people to keep Herzl's dream alive and work towards its completion. And of course, that's what brings us here today. Just a couple of words about the program. David wanted me to emphasize that this is not a history lesson, although he would be happy to chat with any of you more about this at some other time. Instead, this presentation will look at Herzl and his vision in the context of the social issues we are facing in the world today, not just anti-Semitism, but the prejudices and discrimination experienced by others. By the end of this presentation, I think you will agree that Herzl's message is an inspiring one for us all. And just before I turn it over to David, there's a few housekeeping matters that I want to address. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and is also being live streamed on Facebook. Questions can be submitted through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll gather up the questions and address them following David's presentation. And following the webinar, you will receive an email with instructions on how to register your EDI hours with the Law Society. If you're watching this on Facebook Live and didn't register with us directly, please be sure to contact my colleague Igor, whose email address will be on the screen at the end of the presentation, and he will send you the EDI instructions. So now I'm going to turn it over to David to present.
Thank you very much, Gail. My first task is to screen share, so I hope it works. I hope you're seeing a red screen. If not, please let me know. So again, thank you, Gail, for the kind introduction, and thank you, UJA and CJA, for hosting this presentation. And as you heard, this is not a history lesson about Theodor Herzl, although he is an important and interesting person. What this is a story about a person who had an idea, who saw a concern, and he used his skills and his talents, his passion, his energy, his imagination, and his creativity to try and solve that issue. That issue initially related to the Jewish people, but it was a broader concern that he had about freedom and safety for all people. And the hope of this presentation is that all of us, lawyers and non-lawyers alike, are inspired and empowered to use our own skills and talents to help address the significant social issues of our time. And we all know that there are many. As you heard, I have the world's largest Herzl collection, so I will illustrate this story with items from my collection. The first thing you'll see on this screen is a copy, the cover of a book written by Theodor Herzl in 1902. The book was called Alt Neuland, and that's what this is about. It means old new land. He wanted to establish a new society, a model society in the ancient ancestral home of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And that's not Herzl on the cover, that's Moses. And Herzl and Moses were often compared during Herzl's lifetime and afterwards. Both found their people in significant distress and wanted to give them a better future. For Moses, of course, it was slavery in Egypt. For Herzl, it was prejudice, discrimination, and a looming disaster for the Jews of Europe that Herzl saw and anticipated many years before others did. Before we start, just want to recognize we now are in a very unusual and difficult period, the period of the coronavirus. So I hope everyone watching is safe and secure. We were asked to shelter at home because it's at home that we are safe. And that's what Herzl tried to do for the Jewish people, establish a homeland. And he's considered to be the visionary of the state of Israel. In American terms, a combination of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. He was obviously a very important person, so much so that not one, but 2 brands of sardines were made in his honor. Now, one might think that's a pretty goofy, maybe it's not respectful to put Herzl on a can of sardines, but this was done in the 20s and 30s, so long after Herzl died, and it's an indication of the esteem in which Herzl was thought of by the Jewish people. And so Tim Hortons is to coffee what Theodor Herzl is to tiny canned fish. But it was meant as a compliment. Little bit of history about Herzl. He was born in 1860. He died in 1904. So he lived to only 44 years old. Some of these pictures of him, you would think he was 75, 100 years old, but he died when he was 44. He was born in Budapest in Hungary, and as a teenager moved to Austria, and he went to law school. And before going to law school, he was at university in Vienna, was in a fraternity, and he quit his fraternity because he experienced anti-Semitism in it. And he quit being a lawyer because he wanted to be a judge, and in Austria, Jews could not be judges. So then he became a playwright. He wrote a number of plays that were performed in the Viennese theater. And you'll see on the left a play that he wrote in 1894, so he's 33 years old at the time, called Das New Ghetto, The New Ghetto. And what Herzl was describing is his experiences in anti-Semitism, what it was like to be Jewish in European society. You were no longer confined to a physical ghetto, but there was a ghetto in terms of limitations, what you could do, where you could go, how high up you could achieve in European society. This was written in 1894. He then became a journalist, and he wrote for a newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse, a very prominent Viennese newspaper, like the Globe and Mail or the New York Times of its day. And then the top, you see his business card, the bottom, an envelope that was addressed to him in Paris. He became the Paris correspondent for this newspaper, which was a very plum assignment. And as the Paris correspondent, he covered the Dreyfus trial. This was in 1894 and 1895. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army who was wrongfully charged and then convicted of espionage on behalf of the Germans. In a subsequent retrial, he was vindicated and set free. But at this particular time in the trial that Herzl was covering, it created a bubbling to the surface of the anti-Semitism in Paris that lay just below the surface. And what alarmed Herzl was, while he was sitting in the courthouse watching this trial, he heard from the outside cries of death to the Jews. And you heard that right, plural, not death to the traitor or to Dreyfus or to the Jew, but death to the Jews. And Herzl realized that the Jews of France, of all places, France, the home of liberty, equality, fraternity, Jews were in peril. And Herzl, in fact, turned out to be right. Within 50 years of covering this trial, just as an example, in July of 1942, 13,000 Jews in Paris, in this place where this trial happened, were grabbed out of their beds in the middle of the night by French policemen, not German soldiers. France was under the occupation of the Germans at the time, but it wasn't German soldiers. It was French officers rounded up 13,000 Parisian Jews, put them in a sports arena, picture the Scotiabank Arena, and had them sit there for 5 days without food or water and no working bathrooms before they were deported to concentration camps and death camps. And it's reported that only 8 survived. This was the looming disaster that Herzl foresaw when he was covering this trial. And he decided to do something about it. Lots of people see things, problems, and wish that something would happen, but he decided to do something about it. And the first thing he did is he wrote a book, The Judenstaat, a Jewish state. And this was a book which described Herzl's idea. And you can see on the right, these are both versions from 1896. It was published in German initially, February of 1896, and quickly translated into English and many other languages. The subtitle is An Attempt at a Modern Solution of the Jewish Question. The Jewish question is anti-Semitism. And Herzl's idea was, let's have a Jewish state. All of the Jews would leave Europe and go to that state. So there'd be no anti-Semitism in Europe because there would be no Jews. And in that state, there would only be Jews. So there would be no anti-Semitism. In a nutshell, that's the idea. And this is a blueprint of how to go about doing it. And I want to show one excerpt from this book because Herzl asked himself and then answered, on what authority does this happen? Who has the ability to do this? How does this happen? And if you look at the first line, this pamphlet is not intended for lawyers. Even though he was a lawyer, he didn't want to get too legalistic. And having said the pamphlet is not for lawyers, he pulled out from the back of his brain an ancient Roman legal principle called negatorium gestio, which essentially is if there is a person in distress, then somebody without the authorization of anyone, not a court order, not a contract, not agency, not anything, but answering to a higher calling, can go and take responsibility for those assets on behalf of the person in distress. And then he asks in the last paragraph, what does that have to do with what we're talking about, a Jewish state? And he answers it by saying, the Jewish people are presently in a situation of distress. And because they're minorities wherever they live, there is no political power. So let's create a gestor. A gestor is a manager that will look after these affairs on behalf of the Jewish people to create the Jewish state. And then he says, if the gestor, if the manager is an individual, people will think that person's just in it for some ulterior motive. So the gestor should be what he calls the Society of Jews. That ultimately became the Zionist Congress that Herzl created a year or so later, which we'll talk about in a second. And the reason I want to focus on this just one page is what Herzl did was he took all of his skills and talents from being a journalist, from being a playwright, from being a lawyer, and he threw it all at this cause that consumed him for the last 8 years of his life. So having launched this idea, created this book, which became a huge sensation for the Jews of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, where Jews were living under significant oppression, having come up with the idea, he wasn't satisfied with just launching an idea and letting other people take care of it. In fact, when people read the book, they hopped in trains, they went to go visit him. They said, I have to meet this person. Herzl was a known journalist, but he never stood for significant issues for the Jewish people until this book came out. So many people were surprised he was Jewish, and certainly were surprised that he cared about this issue. So they approached him and said, help bring your idea to life. And the first thing he did is he went on a speaking tour. This is a handbill. It's maybe 6 inches by 10 inches. Sorry, I'm not metric yet. It's only been 30 years. But this is about a handbill for a speech that he gave in London, England in July of 1896, a mere 5 months after his book came out. Herzl spoke 5 languages. English was one of them. And then what he did, which was remarkable, was he convened a Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in August of 1897. A year and a half after his book came out, he was able to identify people around the world who were partial to this idea, reached out to them, couldn't Google them, found them, invited them to come to Basel, and they came. And if you note in this composite picture, of course, that's Herzl in the middle, the biggest picture, surrounded by people who appeared to be in tuxedos or formal wear. And Herzl insisted that everyone who came to the Congress wear a tuxedo. As my mother used to say, if you want to be taken seriously, dress seriously. And that's, you can see before you, because Herzl wanted, this was street theater. He used his expertise as a dramatist to connote an image for the world. Interestingly, at the bottom, you will see a row of 13 pictures, all women. There were 13 women among the 250 or so delegates. In the first Zionist Congress, women were only observers. But by the second Zionist Congress, 1 year later, in 1898, women were fully voting members. This, at the time in 1898, women could vote in only one country in the world, New Zealand. In Canada, women received the vote in 1918, and in Europe and in America, 1920. We just celebrated in August the 100th anniversary of that. So Zionism at the outset was a very progressive idea, ahead of its time, not just in terms of solving a Jewish issue, but also addressing other concerns, as you will see. And it was very important to Herzl that this Zionist Congress, all Zionist Congresses, be transparent. There were 6 Zionist Congresses in Herzl's lifetime. He died in 1904, as I said. There were 22 Congresses before Israel became independent in 1948, and the Zionist Congresses continue. The 38th Congress starts 3 weeks from now. It's from Jerusalem, but it is virtual, of course. So on the subject of transparency, Herzl insisted that detailed minutes, verbatim minutes, be taken of all the proceedings. That's what you see on the left, the minutes of the first Zionist Congress, and they're the same for every Congress. And one of the resolutions of the Congress was that Herzl's speeches be independently printed and distributed. And that's what you see on the right-hand side. And the major takeaway from the first Zionist Congress was a resolution of what Zionism was. At the top, you will see that this is an excerpt from the Jewish State, the book we talked about earlier, that the purpose of Zionism was sovereignty assured by international law. Herzl was always concerned that there would be a legal basis for everything that Zionism stood for. And the Basel program, you'll see at the bottom of this slide, is what was adopted at the Zionist Congress in Basel. The aim of Zionism was to establish for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. it was all about having a legally assured right. He didn't want things that were not permitted from a legal perspective. Herzl then set out to create the infrastructure of a state in creation. The excerpt at the bottom of the slide is from a resolution passed at the First Zionist Congress, where the Congress declares in principle to create two institutions, a national fund and a Jewish bank. And the Actions Committee, which was the executive committee or the cabinet, was instructed to bring back to the next Congress 1 year later a plan. So this was about, again, not just talking and meeting, but acting and doing something. So the Jewish National Fund was established in 1901, and that is why here are two images of Herzl connected to trees. It was about buying land in Palestine with contributions from Jews and other supporters around the world and planting trees. Israel is the only country in the world that had more trees at the end of the 20th century than it did at the beginning of the 20th century. And many of the farming communities and cities that is now modern day Israel was purchased with land, was purchased by the Jewish National Fund with funds contributed by Jews from around the world. The second item of infrastructure that was established or authorized to be established was a Jewish bank. And that became known as the Jewish Colonial Trust, which was approved by the Second Zionist Congress in 1898 and established under the laws of England in 1899. And shares were purchased by supporters of the Zionist idea from around the world. Hundreds of thousands of shares were sold. I'm a securities lawyer, and so when I work on a prospectus, it could be 200 pages long. The prospectus for the Jewish Colonial Trust was on a piece of paper the size of a postcard, and they were maybe 8 pages describing it. By 1902, the Jewish Colonial Trust established a subsidiary, the Anglo-Palestine Company, the share certificate you'll see at the bottom of this slide, which became a bank that opened branches in Jaffa, Jerusalem, Tiberias, and if you can believe it, in Beirut and in Gaza, took deposits and used the funds to fund Zionist activities in Palestine. Palestine at the time was a province of the Ottoman Empire. The land that was the first land for Tel Aviv, the city of Tel Aviv outside the border of Jaffa, was purchased with funds loaned by the Anglo-Palestine Bank. Now, as I said, shares were purchased by hundreds of thousands of people from around the world. Shares were for £1 sterling, shares were very expensive at £1, so you could buy them on installments. Share clubs were established, and you would get a booklet, and then when you filled the booklet with stickers, you could get a share. And on the right is an excerpt from the bylaws of a share club, which just explained the details of the sticker. Everything was quite legalistic. And on the bottom right, the sticker on the left is from England. On the bottom right, the same approach took place in Canada. And you can see this blue sticker in the bottom right was from the Canadian Zionist organization. Each sticker was 10 cents. If you had 55 stickers, $5.50, you could buy a share. Herzl became a rock star, and he understood that to inspire the people behind this new idea, he required images and he required ways to inspire people. And he became that image. And he appears on a lot of items, which is why there are so many things in my collection. And I'll go through a few very quickly, but you'll see on the left-hand side, that's a picture of Herzl on the balcony of the Three Kings Hotel in Basel. That was taken in 1901. And under the picture, you'll see Herzl's signature. People went up to Herzl to ask for his autograph, like you would for Austin Matthews or Kyle Lowry. He really was a superstar. And here's Herzl in a bottle. On the right, autographed book with Herzl signing as Benjamin, his Hebrew name, Binyamin. On the left, Czechoslovakian glass. On the right, a certificate for a contribution with Herzl's picture on it. On the bottom right, from Russia, the Hatikva, which it means the hope or our hope, which was the Zionist anthem, became the anthem of the State of Israel, all associated with Herzl. In 1902, Herzl wrote a second book. This is the one that was on the first slide we saw, Alt Neuland, Old New Land. And in this book, Herzl described what he imagined the Jewish state, which he called the new society, would look like 20 years in the future. He was describing the new society in 1923. And he was quite prescient. He talked about communal farming, democracy, science and technology. He talked about electric cars, telegraphic newspapers, which I think he was talking about radio, but we may see a telegraphic newspaper today as the internet, which he obviously could not have conceived of. This book was translated into Hebrew as Tel Aviv, Old New Land, and Tel Aviv in Hebrew. Tel is an archaeological site, which is old. Aviv is spring. And so the city of Tel Aviv is named after this book. And in this book, there's a portion where two characters are talking to each other, two Jewish characters, about the anti-Semitism they're experiencing in Europe. And one says to the other, "Pretty soon they'll make us wear the yellow stars again." The yellow star was a medieval symbol that Jews were required to wear to stand out, to be identified as Jews. And we all know that in the Holocaust, the Germans revived this symbol and made Jews wear it. Herzl was also prescient. As I said earlier, he saw a looming disaster. So in this book, he talks about, he knew that there was an Arab population in Palestine at the time. And in this book, he describes his understanding that the Arab population would welcome the new society established by the Jews. It would raise the economic level for everyone. Everyone would get along and live harmoniously. That, of course, is still a work in process. But this book talks about Herzl's vision of the Jewish state. And as you can tell by now, he was obsessed with securing the future of the Jewish people. But at the same time, he was concerned with another group of people. And I will share this excerpt now from Herzl, from the Alt Neuland. And my problem is I can't see the right-hand side of the, because there's pictures here. But so please take a second to read this. I apologize in advance for the language. It might not be politically correct as we would understand it. It was written in German in 1902, and it was translated into English. But essentially, what Herzl is saying is that once I've fixed the situation of the Jews, I need to turn my attention to another profound tragedy that only Jewish people can understand, which is not only Jewish people, but that Jewish people can understand, which is the question of Africans, which he meant Black people. And he was referring to slavery and how Black people were stolen from their homelands in Africa and oppressed dreadfully. Herzl was aware of that, and he said that he also wants to help solve the situation of Black people. And this is a critical thing to think about. And again, this was in 1902. Herzl, while he was worrying about his own people, was also worried about other people. And this is an important lesson for all of us, that Issues of prejudice and discrimination, they're the same. If they impact one person, or one group of people, they'll impact other groups of people. And if we all work together to try and solve them, we have greater power together than separately. Herzl died in 1904. Tragically, he was a very sick person, but essentially worked himself to death. As a sign of his importance, within 2 weeks of his death, a memorial meeting was held in Carnegie Hall in New York City. Herzl worked so hard, and he spent essentially his family's money and bankrupted the family, so that when Herzl died, there had to be an appeal to raise money to be able to look after his children. So a tragic element of Herzl's story. Herzl kept a diary, and after the first Zionist Congress in 1897, Herzl wrote in his diary, "In Basel, I created the Jewish state. But if I said this out loud, people will think I'm crazy. But maybe in 50 years, 5 years, but certainly in 50 years, people will know I am right." 50 years and 6 months later, the State of Israel was created. And what you have before you is one of the jewels of my collection. It's an invitation to the Declaration of Independence ceremony, which took place on May 14th, 1948 in Tel Aviv. And this most important experience in Jewish history for 2,000 years, the invitation was run on a mimeograph machine and folded and handed out to people. David Ben-Gurion, who was Israel's first prime minister, declared Israel's independence under a portrait of Theodor Herzl. This is an artist's rendition of that ceremony, but Ben-Gurion wanted to tie the realization of Herzl's dream with the vision that Herzl articulated. Herzl wrote in his will, when he died before he died in 1904, of course, he was buried in Vienna, and he asked that when the Jewish state came into existence, he be buried there. So he was ultimately buried on what is now Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. And this is pictures of the ceremony, as well as a ceremonial button that was worn by Herzl's honor guard. And the establishment of the State of Israel created a whole new wave of souvenirs tying the vision to the realization. This is Herzl on a record album, which itself is a nostalgic item about Israeli disco. There was a SS Theodor Herzl ship that sailed on the high seas. We get now to the lessons that I take from Herzl's story. Firstly, that anything is possible. Herzl's motto, "If you will it, it is no dream." In 1896, when Herzl wrote his book, The Jewish State, the idea of there being a Jewish state was the most ridiculous, preposterous notion that anyone ever had. But he got to work on it, talked about it, wrote about it, met about it, and built the infrastructure, and so it happened. So when he says, "If you will it, it is no dream," it's not just talking about something, it's coupling dreams with action. And what he did, as you saw, is he used his skills and talents to help advance the causes he cared about. And we lawyers have special talents that are especially suited for dealing with the social justice issues in which we find the world at this time. Of course, there's the substantive knowledge of legal areas and administrative proceedings and legal proceedings. But beyond that, there are the soft skills that we all have: advocacy, communication skills, creative problem-solving solutions, working in teams, being organized, being able to go from A to Z and all the steps in the middle. We can create a plan. We're no strangers to hard work, that's for sure. We work in teams, we're goal-oriented, and we have passion. We all have the capability of using our skills and talents to help a cause we care about. And the last Herzl lesson is to work to build a model society. The new society that he articulated in Alt-Neuland was intended to be a model society. For Israel, of course, that's a work in progress. There are lots of issues still to resolve. And in many countries, just have to turn on CNN to know that there are many countries that are continue to be work in progress. We as lawyers and non-lawyers watching have the ability to help make things better. Very recent example from last week, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who sadly passed away. This is how she asked to be remembered, as someone who used whatever talent she had to help repair tears in her society to make things a little better. That was sent to me by one of my kids who lives in New York, saying this is a very Herzl message that they on a bus shelter. And I just want to read one paragraph from an article about Ruth Bader Ginsburg that appeared in the New York Times. She envisioned a world different from the one she had grown up in, a better world in which gender was no obstacle to women's achievement, to their ability to dream big and to realize their aspirations. Then she set out to use the law to usher that world into existence. The ability to imagine a different world is what distinguishes the leaders of any social movement. She envisioned a world that was better. Herzl envisioned a world that was better. And all of us too can envision a world that is better. This message is so important to me that I have this one-man project that I call the Herzl Project. Different ways to communicate this message. And this webinar is one of those, frankly. I've created a documentary film. I did a book about my collection. Both the film and the book are available on herzlcollection.com, free of charge. The movie, there's a Vimeo link. So if you have not got enough Herzl out of this webinar, there's much more Herzl content available for you on that website. And I've looked for different ways to communicate the message, and this is one of them. This is Theo, the mascot, which I had made at the Street Characters Inc., a mascot company in Calgary. And here's Theo last year at Met's Field or Citibank Park with Mr. Met, and on the right, in Times Square, visiting his fellow mascots, Olaf the Snowman and Minnie Mouse. On the left is Theo at the Israel Embassy in Washington with Ambassador Dermer. On the right, a trip of Theo to Las Vegas. Theo did not tell me what happened in Las Vegas. And on the bottom right, Theo on a float on a parade down Fifth Avenue, not this year, but the prior year, with the singing sensation Kosha Dils. These are just ways to make the idea of a better future and hope for the future accessible to people. I want to bring it all together with one last story. This label for the Herzl Junior College I found on eBay. And as a collector, if I see something that says Herzl on it, it qualifies for my collection. So I bought it and then tried to learn what is Herzl Junior College. And I found that there is a school in North Lawndale, which is in West Chicago, that's called the Theodor Herzl School. It was built in 1915 when North Lawndale was a Jewish area. There were about 100 synagogues within a 1 mile radius. Over time, the Jews left the area, but while they were there, they asked the Chicago public school system to name their school after Herzl, which they did. The Jews moved to other areas, but the school's name remained the same. And is now, the neighborhood is now primarily Black community and with about 8% Hispanic. But yet the school is called Herzl. And I've gone to visit them a number of times to tell the students about Herzl, about the person who their school is named after. The shirt on the left That's a true picture. That's a shirt that they made at the school. On the top right shows the day where I organized a bus trip of the area for kids from the Herzl School and kids from a synagogue in Chicago to explore the neighborhood together. And the bottom right is Aviv Ezra, who is the Consul General of Israel to Chicago and Midwestern United States, who came to the school that day to talk to the kids about dreams. He's the diplomatic representative in their city of the country that Herzl envisioned. And he told the kids, you too can realize your dreams. On one of my visits, the principal asked for a portrait of Herzl to hang in the auditorium. And my wife was with me at the time. And she said, fantastic. If I can get another piece of junk out of this house, love it. So this was a dedication of that portrait in the auditorium. In this auditorium, on one wall is this portrait of Herzl, and on the other wall is a portrait of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. lived 2 blocks from the school when he came to Chicago in the 60s to work on improving housing. And in the ethos of the school, Herzl and Martin Luther King Jr. are similar, obviously not the same, but both proponents of social justice worked hard to try and improve the condition and future of their people, and both sacrificed greatly for their dream. As a result of this relationship, a partnership was established between the school and Temple Beth Israel, a synagogue in Skokie, who each year buys Christmas presents for all 450 students of the school. It's a very distressed neighborhood. And the kids ask for McDonald's gift certificates or a box of colored pencils. This story has moved a reporter from Chicago's ABC Channel 7 who annually comes. And so these 3 excerpts that you'll see are from 3 different years. And a partnership is established. If you're interested in seeing the whole clip, it's on that website. And then the bottom right, 2 gentlemen who used to go to this school in the 50s or 50s came back to help deliver the gifts. Herzl is bringing people together to help work on understanding of one another and going forward together to establish a better future. And just last week, Tamara Davis, who's the principal of this school, attended a meeting of the American Zionist movement, a board meeting, speaking to 100 representatives of the major Zionist organizations in America, and talked about the dream shared by both Herzl and Martin Luther King Jr. for a better future. Herzl's motto, Im tirtzu ein zo agada, if you will it, it is no dream. As I said, the idea of a Jewish state was the most preposterous, ridiculous idea anyone ever had. And it happened. And in the same way that happened, by Herzl inspiring people to work towards a plan, putting in place an infrastructure to create a plan, using his legal skills and his skills as a dramatist, as a journalist, and as a learned person, was able to create an organization and inspire people to gather around him and follow him after his tragic passing. There is an Israeli song, one of the lines is, Ani ve'ata nishaneh et ha'olam. You and I, we can change the world. So all of us together can change the world. We have the power, the knowledge, and the energy, if we choose to do so, to apply it towards the world's challenges. There are many challenges, that's for sure. So let's do it. Let's try and make the world better. Let's offer a future of hope. As Herzl would say, Im tirtzu ein zo agada. If you will it, it is no dream. Thank you for sharing part of your day with me. And if there's time, I will happily answer your questions.
Thank you, David, for what I found to be a fascinating and really inspiring presentation. And based on the question, I think many others did as well. So we do have a number of questions. We're going to get to as many as we can, and those that we can't answer today, we will follow up by email. Sure. So just picking up on where you left us with that together we can save the world. Somebody sent a comment and a question as such. I am concerned that the creation and maintenance of cultural or religious islands in the long run promotes intolerance. The more we know about other people's situations and backgrounds, the more we can appreciate others' challenges. The more we know people, the better we can see ourselves in their shoes. How do we promote understanding of other cultures while maintaining a safe environment for Jews, Blacks, or any other oppressed groups?
So obviously it's axiomatic. I totally agree with the commenter that we need to get to know one another. And this is an opportunity. I know that there are members of other communities watching, for them to learn about Herzl and Israel and Herzl's concern for anti-Semitism and the solution that he came up with. And we as Jews should be learning about the issues that are out there. There are so many of them. And so absolutely, when in the same way that non-Jewish people have been kind enough to spend some time with us to learn about this, we should do the same, to learn about other people. There are so many problems, and we just have to turn on the television for 5 seconds to see some of the more obvious ones. So we all have a right to be safe and secure, and to do so not at the expense of somebody else, of course. So we need to figure out how we can cooperate and end prejudice and discrimination for all. The commentator is absolutely right. We need to start somewhere by learning about each other. And for those who have been kind enough to watch, I personally will happily return the favor if there's a program that you would invite me to go see so I can learn more about what you experience. I would like to do that.
Thank you. Another question we had from earlier on in the presentation, when Herzl wrote the original book about the answer to the Jewish question or the issue of anti-Semitism, did he realize at the time that the Jewish state would be the Jew of nations and face discrimination and anti-Semitism on a state level?
No, he did not. He assumed that the creation of the Jewish state would be a solution to this issue. He thought that it would be the end of this issue, and of course, that's not how it turned out. There are so many, this idea, any democracy, any new idea has many problems. And one of the lessons from Herzl is if we stop to think about all the problems, or all the things that would go wrong, or all the things that wouldn't work out, we wouldn't start at all. So he wouldn't have imagined, of course, this was in 1896. So the world of communication, the world of power, the English Empire was still in existence, the Ottoman Empire was still in existence. So there was lots of differences. So it's hard to compare our society now with the world that Herzl lived in, but he never would have anticipated that the state of Israel would personify the mega Jew and be the subject of anti-Semitism politically and otherwise from all directions. He would not have imagined that. He would be shocked to learn about it. He would be pleased at least to know that we do have a country so that when these issues become impossible, like they do in some countries, there is a home, sheltering at home, that we can go to. But absolutely, he would not have imagined that 72 years after Israel's existence, the peace with its neighbors remains a work in process. Of course, we just saw within the last couple of weeks, 2 new countries ready to make friends, be friends, and hopefully there'll be more. But absolutely not. Herzl would not have thought this was what would happen from that perspective.
Thank you. And a new question that just came in. Herzl was obsessed with legally obtaining the rights to settle the land of Palestine before settling there. He did not think that groups like Hovevai Zion should have been settling there before they got a mandate of some kind. Do you think his approach to diplomacy and politics was an effort to bolster his own prominence in the movement, or should he have supported those other movements more?
So the question is a good one. Herzl's type of Zionism was called political Zionism. That, as you saw in one of the slides, secured by international law, permitted. He wanted a political solution, and the Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion, and other such groups that existed before Herzl were proponents of practical Zionism. 1 dunam at a time, 1 acre at a time, 1 little farm, 1 little house, bit by bit by bit, let's purchase the land and build a community there. Herzl's concern was that at some point, if you sneak in a little and a little and a little, at some point the Ottoman Empire, who was in charge, will say enough of that, right? Enough of the sneaking in, and then it would all be doomed. So I don't think, and I have not read anything that suggests that the reason he was such a strong believer in practical Zionism was not only because he came up with it, but I think he bona fide believed that this was the way to have a real homeland, not just a couple of farms and villages where Jewish people could go to. That's a great question.
Thank you, David. And I think we're going to have to wrap it up, keeping our eye on the time. Again, if you have questions that weren't addressed and we didn't get to them all, please, we'll post Igor's email address at the end, and you can send them directly to him, and we will make sure, oh, there it is. We'll make sure they get to David. Thanks to all of you so much for joining us today and giving us an hour of your time. I can say without question that it was, for me, an extremely well spent hour. And for those of you who just can't get enough Herzl, you'll be excited to know that CIJA has worked with David to put together a 6-part series on Herzl, the first episode of which is launching today. Herzl Explained is an exploration of Zionism through the examination of items in David's collection of Herzl memorabilia. To view the series, you can visit CIJA's Facebook page. And again, with respect to EDI hours, remember you'll receive an email with instructions on how to register your EDI hours with the Law Society. Remember, if you're watching this on Facebook, be sure to contact Igor so that he can send you the EDI instructions. Those of you who registered through the link will get the email automatically. And finally, we hope to see all of you again at the 4th annual CIJA UJA Legal Conference, which is coming up on February 9th, 2021. On the topic, Rule of Law in Times of Crises. And to David's point, there will be a number of panelists from other communities outside the Jewish community speaking to us about how different communities have experienced not only the COVID crisis, but other crises as well over the past decades. So again, thank you all for joining us. Any follow-up questions, please send them to Igor, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Be safe, everyone.
Bye, everyone.